Hey there, we are live. Happy Friday and Fiction Friday, as I like to call it sometimes. It's Sam here with, I guess I've had on before, but not in a while. This is my lovely wife, the one and only talented, well, lovely, let's say lovely. This is Rachel.
Hi.
Um, yeah, say hi. And
Hello.
um, so the last time I had you on here, I realized was about a year ago
Yeah.
with the audiobook discussion, which was one of my first videos, and
Hmm.
I was just getting started, and I've done one almost every week since then, pretty much.
Yeah.
Sometimes by myself, sometimes with other people, but I'm glad you could join us again. Yeah, we're a little bit busy with a 1 year old who is napping right now, probably, hopefully,
Hopefully.
should be. But the last time I had you on for audiobooks, it was a topic that I honestly that I'm a little bit like weak on. Like it's not really my thing, but it was your
Hmm.
thing.
Yeah.
That's kind of why I thought, hey, I'll go to the expert. So,
I
well,
wouldn't
well,
call me an expert,
well,
but
well more
how
expert than
about
me.
a connoisseur of
Connoisseur,
audiobooks?
connoisseur of audiobooks.
Yeah.
So today I had a similar thought because today's topic is world building, fantasy world building. I mean, I guess there's sci-fi and stuff too, but for our intents and purposes, it's fantasy, sci-fi, fiction, world building.
Hmm.
And honestly, world building is not my strength necessarily. I think I have other strengths in writing.
Hmm.
We'll talk about that in a little bit, but it is your strength, or at least what your passion, maybe both. Um, so,
Yeah, I mean, in our writers groups, everyone has always said that I'm very good with my world building and I have um, good worlds.
mhm,
So I guess, yeah, I guess it's an innate strong suit in my
mhm.
writing.
Yeah, I'd say so.
So.
So that's why I came to you because I'm like I'm not the expert here. So I'm here to ask Rachel questions about world building, what it is, how she does it, all that kinds of things, all that stuff, and hopefully I can take away a few tips maybe, but maybe you all can too. So I don't really want to be the only one talking. Well, I have Rachel too, but post questions in the comments if you have feedback, questions, comments, anything like that. We'd love to make it interactive and hear from you. But I have some questions to get started. So I know a lot of us who are readers and writers, we're probably familiar with the term world building already, but just in
Mhm.
case anyone isn't familiar, or it's we always have to define our terms. Can you tell us a little bit what is meant by that term?
So world building is the process of creating your worlds, basically, and some worlds are more fully developed than
Mm-hmm.
others. We think of like the Star Wars universe that is a fully developed
I was going to mention them. Yeah.
world that has rules that are clearly defined, um,
Mm-hmm.
and story arcs that are accepted, and that sort of
And
thing.
when you say fully developed, I mean even going back to the first movie before there was this whole universe, it was like that there was a culture, there were different races and different groups
Yeah.
with their own histories and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. So it's um, so so it's not just sorry I interrupted, but it's not just like a full universe of stuff, but like how much is your internal history or your internal
Yeah.
I guess culture, world, whatever you've
Yeah.
created.
So when people start talking about world building, um, they're talking about, yeah, the history of their world, the idea of having a concrete, um, almost like a map, you could say, of their world, and um, different societies, different
Mm-hmm.
cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and how all of that interacts. And oftentimes there are people who enjoy world building and are good at world building will oftentimes have um, myriad of content that
Mm-hmm.
never actually gets into their actual story. They just enjoy that process of building the fuller world.
Which is
Um,
why there's so many appendices and the different books in the Middle Earth universe. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so like Middle Earth, Tolkien famous, um, but part of it was Tolkien's methodology,
Right.
right? He was creating a language because that's his love. And he had this philosophy that language creates a culture. So by
Makes sense.
creating a language, he ostensibly then created a culture. And so all of Middle Earth is an outflow of the fact that he was creating this language.
I mean, more than one language, right? I'm not sure how many, but there's different dialects of Elvish.
Yes, I mean, Elvish was the language that he was initially creating. Okay. And as he created the culture and started creating the history, he started creating, the subgenres of elves,
right.
and then allowed for their languages to develop in different ways based on their histories and why would one language be considered high and the other being low, and you've got the high elves versus the low elves and all of that. And so he's done all of that partially because of the way that he was
right.
Developing initially his language, which then creates a culture, which then creates the history, which then creates Middle Earth.
Obviously, we have distinctions like that in real life, in real languages and cultures, but to add it into this fictional world you're creating makes it feel real, makes it feel well thought out and things like that.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why he is the father of modern fantasy, and almost everyone is trying to recreate what he created in a lot of ways. But with their own take and that sort of thing. And so, so world building comes in all shapes and forms. You see it oftentimes in like something like D&D or role-playing games, where you've got, again, a fully formed world with its structures and its rules and its creatures and there's a methodology of how they interact with one another. And then you add the characters then, and oftentimes, particularly with role-playing games, the characters come in and they add even more elements to the world that is being created.
Yeah. I was going to ask you for some of your favorite examples, obviously, or the best known examples of world building. Obviously, Lord of the Rings was top of the list. Star Wars is up there. I mean,
obviously, Dune is another fantastic.
I was going to say Dune. Yeah, our friend, I guess Donald Williams, who's a Tolkien scholar. I think I saw him say one time that after Lord of the Rings, Dune is basically the greatest example of world building we have in the modern universe or whatever. I mean, I've only read the first book. I know there's more that expand on that more, but he just has so many different cultures and politics and he's developed the whole system there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, also you have, the Harry Potter universe, and nice, we could say universe now. My shirt.
I'd like to see your Harry Potter shirt. Hard to see, but I wanted to show that, yeah.
So it's a universe now. I mean, it just started out with those first 7 books, and then you have Pottermore and all of these side stories, and people have asked questions, and the author has interacted with that and fleshed out the world in a more in-depth way.
We have Fantastic Beasts and Of Course a Child, and people are talking about more sequels and spin-offs and things like that.
Yeah, so there's definitely, again, a fuller world. And as people run into questions about, how does this interact? Again, the author and or other people who are privy to be able to answer those questions are able to answer and interact with the fans and creating, again, a deeper, fuller world that acts real.
Which is cool because, I mean, this is probably a side topic, but that level of author-fan interaction hasn't, didn't really exist in Tolkien's time or anything like that. And
definitely a more modern.
I'm sure we could do a whole video on something like that.
Yeah, because that was really fascinating because it has, the Harry Potter has, a cult following, as it were, and people who are very passionate about the world and want to know all these questions, and it's great that the author is willing to interact with the people. Yeah. It's interesting. There are some of my favorite writers have Robin McKinley. She wrote this really, really great book. It's a dystopian vampire novel called Sunshine. and I would love more from this world. And the author's like, yeah, no,
But that's all she wrote.
that's all she wrote. And I'm like, oh, but she created this very interesting, fantastic, world where magic and technology and vampires are all, part of, what would appear like regular, normal society. And but also there's this post-apocalyptic kind of atmosphere as well. It's really cool. And yet that's all she's got in that world, and I would love more, but
that's where fan fiction comes in, I guess.
Right, yeah. I mean, in fan fiction, when when you've got a really good world that your author has created, it does lend itself for good
people telling more stories in that world.
Yeah.
I was gonna go back to the Harry Potter example for a moment, because that one's interesting to me, because it takes place, quote unquote, in the real world. I mean, there's present day England. I mean, it uses real places that exist in the world, and technology exists. I mean, it's not the focus, but but it's like there's this whole secret society of magic users that the ordinary people don't know about, and there's rules for how magic works, and there's histories of the magic houses and different parties and such within it. So she has created. I mean, even if it's set on Earth in the supposedly real world, there's still room for expanding your own concepts and just fleshing out the world or the society, whatever you want to call it, that you've built.
Yeah. And we see that in things like Fantastic Beasts and the creation then of the American wizarding school and all of that, and the way that she's allowed for the world that she created initially in England is now like much broader.
Like there are pockets of magic users all over the world, basically.
Which is kind of cool. It allows, again, for that international interaction, and also allows for the readers to feel connected to the story in a deeper way that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Hey, maybe there's magic users in my country too.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool. Yeah. So I mentioned this earlier, but I'll talk about our different approaches a little bit. So I am not by nature much of a world builder. I'm sure if I tried, I could. If I devoted my energy to that, I could do it. It's just when I write, like I kind of focus on character development and on things like that. Dialogue is one of my biggest things I'm told. But for example, my Fractured Heroes story, the main one I'm working on, it's a superhero story. So when people ask like, what is your world like? I'm like, it's a city. Like it's like New York or Metropolis or Gotham. It's a bustling American city. I created a fictional city, yes, but I'm called Wincham, but I didn't establish new rules or anything for it, because
it's just a city. What does a city look like?
Because I wanted it to feel like an American metropolis, lowercase m. But people have asked me what's your setting like, or how do these things work? And I'm like, it's I don't know. When I need a location, I describe it a little bit. I create a building or something, like a plaza of buildings. I don't know. It's a superhero story. It's set in a city. Just picture what a city looks like. So anyway, that's not my strength necessarily. That's an area I can challenge myself and grow in more. But I know you've written a whole at least one fantasy work, maybe a few different ones, but the one that you've been working on more lately. So what do you find so appealing about world building that you've been drawn to, dedicating so much time to it?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thanks.
So for me, it's I don't have a really I don't have a method really. What I get inspired to write a story because either I picture a scene, or I picture a setting, or I picture like a concept, which I guess then is why world building is probably one of my strong suits, is because I picture the setting, I picture the world, and the story just sort of then evolves from, what would it be like if,
That's a lot of what if questions, and you can
yeah,
your mind go a lot of different
yeah,
places.
and so that's kind of where I go. So like with my current story that I'm working on, The Keepers.
I was going to ask you to tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, well, I can't talk about my
yeah.
process without actually talking about
Go
the
for
story.
it. Tell us about The Keepers.
So, I was sort of inspired by another story that like randomly mentioned that the tombs were sacred, and anyone who entered the tombs could never leave again. And I was like, ooh. And like the story that I read that kind of had this reference, like never really fully fleshed it out, never talked more about it. And I was like, this is fascinating. Like, what would indeed happen if you had, if people wandered into, the tombs of, and then they could never leave again? Like, would they, And so I basically started thinking about what would a culture look like if it was confined to tending for the dead in these tombs that were basically like in these caves / tunnels,
underground catacombs.
Underground catacombs, and they could never leave. And what would that look like, and what would the culture then and society need inside those tombs to become a viable culture? Because if you can't leave, like, how are you, is that a death sentence? Do you just like wander into the depths of the tomb and then die of starvation? Or, so I started asking all of these questions. What would it look like? What are the rules for this world? And so I slowly developed this culture in this world that you had these people who lived in the tombs who cared for the dead, and of course then the tombs had to be guarded, because you don't just want anyone running into the tombs, and you don't want people just leaving the tombs. So then you had this, then I created this sacred order I called the yeomen, who were guardians of the tombs. And then I had then realizing, all right, if the tombs are sacred, why are they sacred? Does this culture worship the dead? Do they worship ancestors? And so I ended up creating
a religion around
around, why are these sacred? And so I've got this death god, Orn, and the goddess of life, and I've created this, I guess it's the people kind of treat it as a dual religion, but
it's not like life is good and death is evil.
Right.
It's like death is sacred, like Orn isn't like a scary death god.
Yeah.
It's like death is peaceful and sacred, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's magic, and a little bit in there, as well as like hauntings and ghosts, and which is another reason why the tombs need to be protected, is because there are evil things that are particularly associated with death that need the living need to be protected from, but also protection from the desecration of the dead, and those sorts of things. So
and within the tomb there's a whole religious order and such, like, because they have their own society, basically their own community.
And then the Keepers, which is what the story I'm calling right now is named after, is the religious order of the priests of Orn, and they're the ones that are allowed to basically transcend from the tombs into the land of the living.
So someone has to.
Someone has to be able to do that.
As we were talking, I was wondering, how do they get food and stuff?
Right.
Obviously.
And I've created this whole system for that as well. And so it just sort of, it started with that one idea from this one story that I read, and it just sort of morphed and started changing and creating, and until I
then you ask questions, and your creative mind fills in the gaps.
And so for me, as I'm writing, the world building takes place, and as I'm telling my initial story, there are times where I've got to stop and I've got to like think through like the order of things, and so I've got a few like side notes and stuff about like what's my hierarchy, why who's beholden to who, and that sort of thing, and how is it all working,
what are the tensions between these different groups, like if there's different religious orders, some above ground, some below ground, and things like that. Like how do they interact?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's my process, I guess, is that I just sort of um, let the world kind of tell my story. So I guess, um, yeah.
Okay. There you go. You answered a few questions at once. Yeah, thanks for the keepers. I was also going to ask you about your process, and you said earlier you don't really have a method, but it sounds like you kind of you start with an idea and you write as much as you can, and then when there's you run into something that you're not sure, I'll be like, oh, I need to think about this and flesh it out more. Is that kind of
that really is. I will sometimes write myself into a corner, and then I have to ask myself, okay, what are the rules of my world that I can use to then like get me out of this? With the keepers, what happened is I've sort of jumped around and started creating all of these sub stories that are all connected to the main story to kind of help push the story along.
Which is why it's so long, and
it's not finished. Because again, I think what I just said was I let the world building tell the story.
It's good.
And so I think sometimes I get too caught up in the world building.
That is a potential pitfall.
There was a joke in the Inklings group. We were reading
our creative writing group,
and one of our friends was like, "Wait, what chapter are you on?" And I was like, "I think I'm on chapter like 9, 10." She goes, "Where's your bad guy?" And I was like, "Well, you met him in the prologue." And she's like, "Yeah, I know, but where's your bad guy?" And I realized that like I had been spending 9 chapters of world building,
establishing the characters, establishing the culture,
right? But I hadn't really established any the real conflict.
The conflict wasn't there, or at least was very vague. Yeah,
it was more like social conflicts as I was developing and fleshing out the world, in which my main bad guy was sort of like in the background. He existed, but he wasn't really like there. So that is a drawback, I feel like, for my writing, that I spend so much time world building that I don't actually tell my story.
So I think we could say the ideal story has a balance of both, and knows how to balance them well. And if I had to make a general statement, I'd say readers these days, they don't. I mean, there are some successful works that have done lots and lots of world building. Obviously we mentioned Lord of the Rings and Dune. I'd also add The Wheel of Time. I'm only 2 books in, but I know there's 14 books and they're long, and I know there's lots of different subplots, lots of things going on there. So like there is an audience for that, but I feel like a lot of readers these days may not have the patience for it. I mean, yes, there's always a hardcore fantasy fan who will devour something like that, but I feel like the ideal is to strike a balance so that your readers are like, oh, it's a fully fleshed out world, but it also has a plot that's moving somewhere, and it's hard to do.
Yeah, and I think also publishers are less inclined to publish the full length, fully involved fantasy story that might have inspired us to write our epic tome.
Like, I mean, if Lord of the Rings was submitted today, I feel like it would be a lot different. But,
I don't think Lord of the Rings would have been published today.
Sad,
right? Like, I just don't feel like the publishers would know what to do with.
I mean, even in Tolkien's day, he tried to put it out as one book, and they were like, "This is too long."
It's too long.
And he's like, "What do you mean too long?" No.
And so I think that also hinders, those of us who love the in-depth world building that creates those epic tomes. But Wheel of Time, like, there's 14 of them.
I think so.
I think of I really enjoy David Eddings as a fantasy writer. And most of his novels, fantasy novels, are thick, and they are like in trilogy setups, and so it gives him the opportunity to fully flesh out the world that he has created. But then I think about the things that are being published right now, and if it's a first-time author, you're going to be looking at a smaller book.
Most likely. That's why I've shared this elsewhere in my videos, but like I pitched my novel to an agent and I was told to cut it down because it was super long. That's why I'm still in my editing process. And yes, there is an audience for very long sci-fi and fantasy, but usually not your first work out of the door unless you get really lucky, maybe. But so,
yeah, you've got to have a name, I think, out there first.
Yeah.
So like I think of like Sanderson, he's able to produce long-winded volumes.
Does he do a lot of world building? I haven't read Sanderson yet. I need to.
Yeah, and his I read Mistborn, and you know the interesting thing is I feel like his first story in the Mistborn series was just really just an epic heist, and had the heist plot. And since he chose arguably a generic plot, it allowed for him then to focus a little bit more on the world building.
Okay.
And he fleshes out the world more and more in each of the subsequent stories. Cool. So that it is fully it's a really interesting world that he creates in the Mistborn series. Okay. So yeah. So I think there's also that aspect, you know, like if you find a plot device that allows you then to focus more on a particular concept.
Yeah. Tropes. When you're, I said this before too, but when you're introducing someone to a new world, like the tropes can really help. I mean,
yeah.
Trope. I know tropes get a bad rap because we think that, you know, it's like, oh, it's too tropey, but I mean, stories are made of tropes. You know, all stories have tropes, and the familiarity of the tropes is something we can latch on to. I think I mentioned that when I was reading Neuromancer, and it was, you know, it was like a new world I wasn't familiar with cyberspace, and I mean, I wasn't familiar with his version of cyberspace or whatever, but I was like, okay, there's a heist, like
I can follow this.
Like the main guy is a hacker. He's down on his luck. Everyone, you know, he's maybe an anti-hero, maybe a Han Solo type ish at first, and I'm like he's, you know, he owes money to the wrong people, and he's got to do a heist to get out of it, and of course there's twists and turns, and I'm like, okay, even if I don't know all the details of the world yet, like I can latch onto that, and I can follow that, and that helps guide me through this new unfamiliar world.
Yeah.
So
and so that is helpful, and I think you know, I think about like we make fun of the trope of the poor farmer kid, you know,
Luke Skywalker,
who all of a sudden realizes he's the chosen one. Yeah, you got Luke Skywalker. You've got
Aragon.
Aragon was like that. I
mean, they're not all farmers, but like Peter Parker, you know, the teenager who was raised by his uncle, and so
there's that trope.
The nobody who becomes somebody. Also Harry Potter.
Yeah, Harry Potter follows that trope. Again, like, you know, and it works, and then it allows for. I think it allows for the world building then to take place around a familiar trope, and so the trope no longer feels so generic and so familiar.
Right. It's like this familiar thing, but in a new setting, and you're like, oh.
Right. And then this familiar thing then interacts differently because it's a new setting.
Right. Yeah. So there's lots of, you know, different elements. I mean, everyone says there's nothing new anymore. Most stories are just combining old things in new and original ways. So you just got to find a way that makes sense for your world and for your ideas and for your and for what you're doing with your story. Make it feel original by combining old things in new ways. Do you have to do a lot of research for your world building?
Great question.
Thanks. In
reading, I love historical fiction. I tried to write historical fiction, and then I realized, that requires a lot of research. I am lazy.
I have not written historical fiction.
So I discovered very quickly that historical fiction requires way more research than I'm willing to put into. So my research primarily consists of what I would call people watching.
Okay.
So one of the things that I do is I pay attention to the rules of our world, and or the rules that I see in other worlds, other fantasy stories, and I go, okay, that worked really well in this world. I'm going to take those rules and I will apply it then to my world.
Mhm.
So I do a lot of borrowing. So I guess my research is um, reading other fantasy,
Always a good start.
always a good start. Um, and even reading literary criticism or on the classics and things like that has also
Mhm.
really helped as they draw out themes and ideas and how to go about doing that. To sort of help me in my world building and in my writing in general. Um, I also, watching favorite TV shows
Yeah.
and um, looking at how they develop their world. So one of my favorite television series is Stargate, and I just love the world that they have created um, and how it interacts with our world and that sort of thing and so just by watching how they deal with the conflict of old religions meeting up with new religions and um, modern concepts butting heads with more traditional values. How do we reconcile those things? Um, and so, that's one of the things that I then incorporate into my world building.
Mhm.
Because that's actually another one of my themes floating around in my story. It's a fantasy story, which almost inevitably when we think of fantasy, we're like, oh, it's like Lord of the Rings, and it's like medieval.
But yours is more like.
I would argue that it's more like Industrial Revolution shift.
I was going to mention that if you hadn't already. Yeah. Because we when we were first hearing it at Inklings, we thought, oh yeah, medieval fantasy. But then you were like, you were. I don't know at what point you accepted this idea, but you were meaning to be like the a magical version of the Industrial Revolution. So
Yeah.
So there is there is these ancient religions that go back a long time, but like the outside world is on the cusp of technology and things like that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
sorry,
So
sorry,
that's okay.
Stole that out of your mouth.
No, it's fine. So that's one of the things that I guess I was probably inspired by stuff like Stargate, of seeing that conflict of modern meets up with the ancient, and how do we confront that science versus religion. So the religion feels old and kind of medieval. If you think about how parts of the Catholic Church might have felt during the Industrial Revolution, it feels backwards, but at the same time, there is the spiritual truths there, and how do we convey those spiritual truths in a world that is seems to be progressing beyond the traditional ideals. So I allow myself to observe um, philosophies and art modern day conflicts and allow for that to be kind of my guide for um, how I want to confront those concepts in my story and in my world. So my research is basically everyday life.
Okay.
I don't know if that really helps.
It does. I mean, we draw influence from all kinds of places.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if you've done much research into the Industrial Revolution era.
I mean, outside of reading and studying that time period, so
That's a good start. I mean, that's research.
Yeah. So I mean, some of my favorite writers, um, reading Dickens, reading Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot, all of those authors deal with that conflict of progression and industrialization meeting up with the pastoral and the everyman. But Tolkien and C.S. Lewis also dealt with their own type of industrialization confronting with traditional values. You see that particularly as Tolkien deals with the scourging of the Shire and what Saruman was trying to do in the Shire as he sort of industrialized it. And Tolkien is appalled by this, and he wants his readers to be appalled by this, that this beautiful idyllic place, is ravaged by machinery.
Mhm.
I mean, the same thing with Fangorn Forest and
Right.
Isengard. Like again, you see the forest being torn down for industrialization, and so I find inspiration in other works,
Okay.
and so that's my research.
Okay. So I was just thinking, you also have this other strength that I don't have, which is like you pick up on details when they're wrong. Like either, I mean, sometimes my stories, sometimes other people's stories, and when we were critiquing them, you'll be like, oh, that's an anachronism. Like that wouldn't happen this time period if it's a period story or a time travel story or things like that. So I mean, you've obviously learned a lot. Just I guess retained a lot from reading.
Yeah.
To know these things.
Yeah, I think that the best way to to be able to pick up on those things is to be well read, be a student of history, and be a student of everyday life,
culture,
and culture. People are like, how do you know so much about like medical stuff? And I was like, well, I also like to watch crime shows. So
also you're a family background in
I do have
in the sciences
but like like I watch crime shows, and
yeah,
and so I pick up details in my crime shows,
and I haven't retained that. Yeah, or either I haven't watched as many other shows or I haven't retained it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just I think again becoming a student of the world around you, and paying attention to the world around you is one of the best ways that you can work on world building.
Yeah. Giving you a lot to work with for sure.
Yeah.
And it also makes you a good fact checker and sounding board for other ideas, as we talked about. Yeah.
Yeah. I used to say I'm full of random and useless facts until it comes to
they're useless.
Fact checking other people.
They're useless until they're not. So
yeah.
So there you go. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing. The last question I was going to ask was, what advice would you give to someone like me who is maybe a writer but not as strong on world building, or maybe wants to grow in that area or hasn't really done it before? Where do you think is a good place to start, or just any good tips or principles you can throw out there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've read a bunch of different people's advice on this topic, and I would recommend, for someone like you, right? So you talked about your city, or like it's just a city.
It's a big city.
It's a big city.
It's a big urban, American city.
And so what I always like to do is say, okay, all right, well, where is my city? Is my city in the Midwest, or is it in New England? Is it where am I placing the city? Because that's going to affect what the city looks like. Is it a port city? Because again, that's going to change how the city looks, where the downtown center of the city is going to be built up around. And then I also would suggest, if you're struggling with, creating and world building, again, for a city, I would just look at pictures of cities.
That's fair.
Look at the different architecture of the different kinds of cities. Is this a modern city that's been built up in the last 200 years, or is this like an old city that's got bones from 2,000 years ago? Because that's going to have a different feel. And it's going to look very different than a more modern industrialized city. So those are the sort of things that I would start asking myself. Again, it's kind of all of those like what if kind of questions, and then just sort of like allow myself to sort of build out from there. What makes my city unique from the other cities,
Right.
And you can even do that, even just do a comparison of of two cities here in the United States, right? Chicago is different than Fort Worth. What
Mm-hmm.
makes Chicago different than Fort Worth? And, so that's kind of, as you start thinking about those sorts of things, those differences, and allow yourself to kind of develop a city. I also like to draw maps. I love maps.
That's good. I haven't done that yet.
So, one of the things that I did for a story is I realized I had this very complicated structure, a class system, and so my city had to be divided up into basically like little boroughs, and so I went through and I basically drew a city city map with streets and squares and embassy buildings and all of that sort of thing to kind of give myself a sense of, okay, this is my city. How are my characters going to interact with that? So that's another thing that you can do to help world build.
So what I'm hearing is just ask a lot of questions and find the answers and use real life materials to get inspiration.
Yeah.
For the
definitely.
Answers. Yeah.
And the other thing that I would encourage is also then work on consistency.
That's true. That's a good point.
Your readers are going to notice as much as you're like, even if you as the author can't remember, your readers notice. I remember there was a big to-do years ago that George R.R. Martin got the eye color wrong in one of his books, one of his characters, and people were horribly upset. And I was like, it's eye color. He's got like a gazillion characters.
Mm-hmm.
He's written how many words, and he just forgot that so-and-so had blue eyes versus green eyes or whatever. But it was, people were upset.
These things happen. Side note from my area, there was an early issue of Amazing Spider-Man where Stan Lee wrote it as like Peter Palmer because
he couldn't remember his name.
I've heard him say before, like I always try to choose like a double letter name so I can remember it, but he forgot it, and there was no one back then to fact check him or anything like that back in the '60s. So like there's one issue that calls him Peter Palmer or something
Peter
like
Palmer.
That. Yeah. Anyway.
So so if you're finding it difficult to remember the world that you're creating, make a list or write a paragraph that describes the key details of your city or of your landscape or whatever it is that you're building.
See, I'm a planner, so I would need to write it out.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if you've done that extensively, but not all up front. You said it kind of as you go along.
Yeah, it kind of goes along. And so one of the things that I've done is I actually have build some maps because I'm a very visual person. So maps, I love it. When I read a book that has a map, I'm like, ooh, I can see where things are. That really helps me. And so, maybe build a map of your city, just again, so you get a sense for the layout of, where things are happening and, again, the connection, particularly if your city is key to the plot.
Yeah, that's important.
And I would argue that most settings offer insight into your plot.
They should.
And they should.
At least to some extent. I mean, some more than others, but still.
Yeah. And so I think about like your story, and you've got some major fight scenes that are out in the city streets, and you've got that one scene towards the end, in the warehouse district.
The warehouse, or I think I might take it to a lab because we talked about that too. But yeah, I need to figure out where these things are, and
right.
the heroes have to get there, and most of them can't fly.
Right. So you gotta think about the logistics. Like, what does this look like?
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that, I think it's important as you are creating your story that you allow for the setting to help you make it more real. Yeah, because I remember we talked about, like, initially you had the serum, like, sort of like in your generic 1980s chemical
that's the
comic book scene.
that's the other thing you've helped me with is I've based a lot of this on comic book tropes or I mean TV tropes and things. I mean not the website, just in general. And you've been like, that's not how it works in real life. And
Well, not anymore.
Or not,
it might have
maybe once, yeah. So
Yeah.
so I was like, yeah. Why have they don't have this open vats of chemicals in random warehouses like in Gotham City.
Right.
But these days we have labs and hopefully safety measures and things
Right.
like that. Yeah.
And so you were dealing with the super serum and how like they were trying to develop superpowers, and it was obviously that it was like in a lab, and so where would this lab be? Would it be inside a warehouse,
Probably not.
or would it be part of the downtown district? And I think of like other stories that can kind of help inspire us to kind of help with that. So I think of things like, I think for me, I immediately started thinking of like Mission Impossible. I can't remember which one it was, but it was the one with the bioterrorism, where they're trying to prevent this disease from spreading, and they needed the antidote. And anyway, and they basically crashed into a lab. It was really cool because it's Mission Impossible. Everything they do is really cool.
Is that Ghost Protocol? I'm not sure anymore.
I don't remember anymore. It doesn't matter. So the point is, like, I listened to your story, and then I saw a more modern interpretation of something similar, and I was like, wait a second, like, this isn't jiving with, if you want your story to be modern, what would that look like, right? If you're relying too heavily on the 80s comic book tropes, which, by the way, were great
in the 80s, which was 20 years ago, or 40 years ago,
30 years ago, going on 40 now, like all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, this isn't, this doesn't make for a modern story, and so we've got to like.
I've had to reconcile some of that with myself. Well, especially because I've been working my story for 10 years. I began writing the first draft in 2010, and
the world has changed.
Even then, the world has changed. I actually was editing a scene last night, and I included a phone booth, or I had that originally, and I'm like, there's barely payphones anymore, not booths. I did some very brief research Wikipedia, like in New York, they've preserved some historical phone booths just because it's classic or whatever.
Yeah.
So like big cities might have a few left, still not many, obviously.
Yeah.
So I was like, I can include it, but I kind of have to make it obvious that this isn't on every street corner or whatever.
Right.
Because
think about the Matrix, like they use phone booths, but even that is anachronistic nowadays.
Yeah, no.
Oh yeah. Man.
We're talking about this. I realized the movie Elf came out in like 2003 or whatever, something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a funny line where he mentions a VCR. He's like, I'm sorry, I stuffed the living cookies into the VCR, and I'm like, kids watching it these days, what's a VCR?
Right.
So I think it's funny.
Yeah. So when it comes to world building, you've got to ask yourself, what's your setting? When it comes to Harry Potter, I remember Rowling intentionally saying that, like, basically the events that she was recounting, as she wrote in the 90s, basically, but were started like in the 80s. So like. She had a specific time period, essentially, that she was dealing with.
Yeah, I grappled with that for a little bit. Like, what if I set my story like in 2000, like make it, a period piece. That would make some things easier. I kind of went against that at the end. I'm trying to modernize it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think for your story, I think modernizing it is a better angle because of the insurgence of Marvel Universe. I feel
right.
That to make your story more, what's what I'm looking for? I don't remember anymore.
Accessible, maybe?
Accessible.
And
would be to make sure that you stay modern. And this is one of the reasons why I write fantasy, because my world can be whatever I want.
And I use familiar settings. It's a fictional city. I didn't choose New York or anything like that, but partially because I haven't lived or explored there. But still, I'm like, it has to be like a real city in many ways. Yeah.
Oh, I did remember. I did do some research on Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
So One of the things I was thinking about was that I incorporated was the invention of the bicycle.
Oh
So I
yeah.
did a little bit of research on the invention of the bicycle, and so my story has some talks about people and bicycles and some of the earlier inventors.
Which you don't-
inventions of the bicycle, which is kind of fun.
Which you don't really expect in fantasy, but
Right.
but hey, it's you know,
It
it's
was-
a broad mix.
Yeah, and it was a way in which I could kind of help show the fact that my world was more industrial
Yeah.
than medieval.
I wonder how much faster it would have been if the Fellowship of the Ring had bicycles
Bicycles don't really work well
on mountains and on all that terrain. That's true. Yeah.
or in rivers.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. For parts of it, maybe, but yeah. Anyway.
So anyway, so I did do some research.
There you
Thank
go.
you, Wikipedia.
Yeah, I mean, when I say research, I did very cursory research last night on Wikipedia, just to be like, and it had a list of like how many phone booths are left in America roughly, and it said it's like 5% of what there was in 1999.
Yeah.
And anyway, yeah. So
yeah,
there you go. Okay. Well, thanks for all your tips and insights.
Thanks. This was
About
fun.
about world building and all the different ways that can go. Anything else you want to say to the people watching at home?
Just encourage you guys to, you know, as you're creating your story, think about the world that you're writing in, and you know, have fun with it.
Mm-hmm.
I know that, you know, we don't like to have stuff that will never see the light of day, but for me, that's a lot of the fun things. The charts, the maps,
writing the background stuff,
Yeah.
and only a fraction of it makes it into the story.
Yeah, but because I have all of that as a reference, I feel like my story is deeper and fuller, and it feels more real. And that's, you know, I think about all of the stories that my favorite stories are the stories that I can get completely immersed into the world. And I'm not constantly going, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense.
How does that work? Yeah.
How does that work? And so, again, I just, you know, have fun. Create your story, create your world, create consistencies within your world, and just have fun. Be creative.
Okay. Well, you heard it here first, folks. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Thanks again for Rachel, the world building expert or connoisseur.
Connoisseur isn't better.
For answering our questions, and thanks to all of you for listening and watching, whether you were with us live or watching and listening to the replay later. Yeah, as always, follow me for more content for writers. You can find my link in the comments and subscribe. And keep writing, reading, and rocking. And we'll see you next time.
All right, bye.
Bye.